The New Orleans Saints are facing a really pivotal game next Sunday against the Falcons. They have a bye week to try and figure it out. The question is, will they? We'll talk about it right here on the Straight Up Saints podcast.
You're listening to the Straight Up Saints podcast.
What is up, Who Dat Nation? Welcome back inside another edition of the Straight Up Saints podcast. It's your host, Chris Vogel. As always, we're brought to you by Scott Fickner. Injury lawyers. You've been injured in any kind of accident, car, truck, 18-wheeler, or hurt offshore. Scott Fickner handles it all. You give him a call at 504-500-1111 for a free consultation. They'll always fight for the win. Joining me on this edition of the Straight Up Saints podcast is former Saints wide receiver Lance Moore. Lance, how's everything going, man?
Doing well, man. It's funny listening to the read when I don't have to do it. I already know what's coming. But shout out to Scott McNair. Let's get after it, man.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I think, us, like many other people, were hoping this was going to be, not just a season where the Saints are competing for a playoff spot, which they still are, even at 5-5 in the NFC South. But, we had a lot of optimism, especially when you add a veteran quarterback like Derek Carr. And prior to the Vikings game, the Saints have been relatively healthy, which has not been the case for them the last couple of years. So the roster we felt like was there. And so far, it's not working. At least to the degree that we expected. Being 5-5 at the bye week, I probably don't think either one of us expected that to be the record, especially given the schedule and the talent. For you, when you hear that, they're going to stick it out with the coaching staff for now. I know we've been big proponents of you don't need to just start saying heads have to roll just for the sake of doing so. But are you a little surprised a change hasn't been made yet, considering it feels like the offense is kind of going back into that state of just not having that juice that they showed maybe against the Colts?
Honestly, I'm not surprised. The front office, Mickey Loomis, head coach Dennis Allen, they're loyal guys, right? And almost loyal to a fault at times, one could say, I guess. But the reality is, as tough as it feels after a loss, and specifically to the loss last week against the Vikings, we are still sitting at first place in the NFC South. It's not what we all expected as far as the offense goes. I think we're kind of like in the middle of the pack as far as points per game. But the reality is offense is down throughout the league this year. Points are like the lowest total in a long time as far as the top ranked team to the bottom ranked team on average. So it's not like we are this one outlier of an offense who can't seem to score points. Even looking at like Kansas City, who always seems to score a ton of points because they got Patrick Mahomes, they've got Travis Kelce, and by the way, they've got Andy Reid, who's I think probably the best play caller in all of the National Football League. Even their points are down. So, it's strange because I can't necessarily put my finger on it. It's not like defenses are just so much better this season, but for whatever reason, the defenses have had the upper hand. And offenses have struggled throughout the entirety of the National Football League. Sure, there are things that our offense needs to do better. And there are mistakes that seem to be repeated over and over again. And those are the things that kind of bite us in the butt. We get things going a little bit on offense, and there's a penalty, whether it's a hold or some kind of other infraction that sets us back. We're behind the chains. And I think that's another thing. Getting behind the chains, not being able to stay on schedule has really just put a wrench in what we want to do offensively. I think playing offense in the National Football League is big, or is important to have a rhythm, right? We had a couple of games in a row where we were into a great rhythm. We had a lot of yards. We were scoring points. We get in the red zone. We're capitalizing with touchdowns. And Minnesota did a great job of getting us out of rhythm. To me, that game was as much on the preparation as far as the coaching staff goes, the plan that we had in place. Minnesota blitzes more than anybody in the National Football League. We should have been better prepared for that. It's not like they were making up blitzes, brand new blitzes that nobody had ever seen, and they were going to trick us. Like that's not possible, right? Like it's the blitzes that they were running are blitzes that have been in the National Football League for a long time. Sure, it takes a little bit more effort out of your front and your quarterback to diagnose what's happening. But for us to not be fully prepared and to be able to capitalize on what they were doing, to me was disappointing. And, it's Still, with the disappointment, like I said, we're still sitting in first place.
Yeah, and you mentioned the blitz thing. I mean, coming into this game, everyone talked about number one in blitz rate, Vikings, number one in six-man rushes or more, Vikings. So that definitely surprised me too. And it's a little frustrating because I thought they were running the ball well with Alvin to start the game. But once you go down 17-3 or
Yep.
worse at halftime, 24-3, it's like, all right, you kind of throw the run game out the window. But I think, something you mentioned, you talked about the first place aspect. And I do think whether Saints fans like it or not, that definitely plays an impact on how aggressive you may be in making a move. Like, for example, the Bills, same record as the Saints, but they're in a loaded AFC right now, and they felt like, man, we got to make a change. They get rid of Ken Dorsey. Not every record is created equal in the sense that I don't know if we've seen a team lead a division, regardless if the division's good or not, and make a massive change to the coaching staff. So I understand why it hasn't happened. What I would ask you, Lance, is this: if this season doesn't get better, let's say, and the Saints do miss the playoffs, which I honestly don't think is going to be the case. I think that if you look at their schedule, they have enough favorable games that I think they're going to find a way to maybe get to 9-8 or 8-9, and maybe that's enough to win the division. But if it isn't a playoff appearance for the Saints team, like, how serious is it to say, okay, like, wholesale changes around the staff probably have to get made? Because I agree with you. Offense is down in this league. I was looking at the Saints points per game, and I was looking at them averaging a little over 21. I thought, man, that's got to be low. And I looked at the rest of the league. I'm like, it's not that huge of a gap from
Right.
everyone else, which is crazy to think. But how likely do you think there'd be major changes if this team does fail to make the playoffs with 7 games left?
Yeah, I mean, look, we like you said, there's 7 games left, so there's still a whole lot of football to happen. And honestly, it's gonna be a major kind of turning point, I feel, in this organization if we don't win the South and make it to the playoffs. And not necessarily turning point as far as the moves that they're going to make, but the decisions that they're going to have to make. Are we gonna keep going down this road of mediocrity per se? Or are we going to say, you know what? We had a great run. We've got to start making changes. We've got a defense that's still playing, top 10 defense in almost every single category, but we're not getting any younger on defense. And to expect all of those guys that have played so well for so long to continue to play at that rate without the offense holding up their end of the bargain, um, you know, contract situations, potential free agents. It's more than just the coaching staff, and it's got to be obviously a more long term play. Um, but you have expectations within the organization, and obviously the expectation is to win the South and to be able to compete for a chance to make it to the Super Bowl. That doesn't change regardless of who the staff is. But if you're failing to meet those expectations, then you've got to really take a serious look at what are we doing, who's at the forefront, what are the issues that need addressed, where's our money tied up, and how do we mitigate those issues. It's above my pay grade. Shoot, I'd love to be in Mickey Loomis's seat to really sit down and assess every single thing that's going on in the organization from top to bottom, because 5-5 is not where we should be, honestly. I mean, I feel like our team is too good. I feel like we've been in close games where we've had opportunities to potentially pull out wins. That 5-5 could be 7-3 or better. And that 5-3 could also be 3-7 or worse, based on how the ball has kind of fallen per se in some of these games. So I really went a long ways to not answer your question, but I do feel like the pressure, if we don't win the South and make the playoffs, is going to be at an all-time high, at least in recent years, for this organization.
Yeah, no, and one thing I like that you mentioned, you brought up expectations, and that kind of leads me to a point about kind of getting into the subject of Derek Carr, because I think, with any quarterback, especially when you sign a bigger contract, obviously there's going to be expectations thrusted upon you, whether it's fair or not. And I think for this situation, it's interesting because I don't think it's as simple as going, man, the Saints are 5-5 and struggling because Derek Carr is not playing well. I think it's not as simple as that. If it were that simple, Saints could make a change and all of a sudden maybe they get back on track. There's a lot of moving factors and parts as to why they are 5-5, as you mentioned, maybe not 7-3, because that's honestly what came to the top of my head, whether it was the Packers game or the Texans game. You start thinking of certain aspects where, man, the Saints, a drive here, a drive there, yeah, the record's looking a little bit better. You're in that top 2, top 3 seeds in the NFC, but they're not. For Derek Carr, though, we're through 10 games. He's only got 10 touchdown passes. Now, he's been injured twice. I'd imagine the shoulder injury re-aggravating it is not ideal. And since week 3, you can argue maybe that's played a factor in his struggles. Are you a bit surprised, though, by how the passing game has looked? Because for me, the one thing that surprises me with Derek Carr right now, and maybe I just missed this during his time at the Raiders, just feels like there's moments where he's holding the ball a little too long.
Mhm.
And I look back at the Vikings game that, he has Shaheed open on the right. He misses him. It is what it is. But then he holds the ball too long and ends up having, losing the football in a strip sack. Now he recovered it and then unfortunately gets hurt on the next play. But for me, I just haven't had one of those games yet. I thought the Colts game was close to saying, wow, that's a great performance from Carr. But it's not happening consistently for you. Are you kind of surprised? And do you feel like maybe this is who they have right now at quarterback? Or maybe it's not just all on Derek? And look, there's so many factors, whether it's play calling, whether it's guys be on the same page. What's kind of your assessment of Derek Carr?
I think it's both, right? Like we're lacking consistency, right? And I do feel like the play calling could help him a little bit more. But at some point, for a guy who is as highly compensated as he is and has been around the game for as long as he is, you would love to see him elevate those around him. Sure, we have a deficiency on the offensive line. We've had a number of different injuries, and we've got a left guard that's playing left tackle right now. I get it. I understand how difficult that is. And for those who don't understand, it's what Andrus Peat is doing right now is one of probably the hardest things for a big fella to have to do. Like people always talk about, well, he's a left tackle. He can move over and play right. Well, that's hard because you're not used to that. But having to be able to move in space against some of the most athletic, quick, and powerful guys on the entire football field is tough. But Derek Carr knows that. He knows that Andrus Peat is a guard that's out there playing tackle, right? So maybe he needs to be a little more cognizant of that when he's taking the snap and understanding who is across from him, right? Who is the pass rusher that's across from Andrus Peat? Okay, maybe I need to be a little bit quicker getting the ball out in this situation because this guy's over here. And like I said, the play calling goes along with that, right? If we're just doing a bunch of dropbacks, there's no quick outlets, it's hard for him to get the ball out of his hands quickly. But I think the best thing that can help this offense is a consistent running game, honestly. Being able to use our backs, and that would be Derek Carr's best friend, is being able to go out there and teams truly not knowing whether we're running and passing the football. He's been banged up. But the reality is most of these guys are banged up halfway through the season. It's you're not going to be 100% all the time in a season. And it sucks that it's his shoulder that's banged up. But his accuracy and his arm strength doesn't seem to be affected by that shoulder. So I think that he needs to play better, but I think it's not just him who needs to play better. I think the offensive line needs to play better. I think the play calling should be a little bit better. The collective group, I would imagine, would all tell you to a man that they're not playing up to the standard that they have set for themselves.
Yeah, and you mentioned the run game. I put these stats together because before the season, and you were right about this because I think when he's running the football and getting his opportunities, it's pretty clear that Alvin's still that guy. There has not been a moment this season where I watched Alvin, whether it was a reception or a rush, and go, it doesn't look like the Alvin of old. Like he still has like that it factor. But yet, the running game as a whole, they're bottom 10 in rushing yards, they're bottom 5 in yards per carry. And I don't know if it's more so, there's been talk about them not being comfortable when they're running to the left side of the line. There was talk about, just trying to figure out who's going to be that RB2. 1 week it'd be Jamal, 1 week it's Kendra Miller. Either way, it just to me sometimes feels like if Taysom Hill's not dominating on the ground, this ground game's not going, or they're not being very diverse with the way that they utilize. And I find that just kind of odd because the talent's there. There's no question about it. For that aspect of the Saints offense, how much does that surprise you that we know the pieces are there and we know Alvin is still an elite capable back, but it's not a backfield that in terms of yards right now is producing at a high clip. And to your point, if it was, maybe the play action game works and that helps Derek Carr in aspects. So just where's your surprise factor in that and just like not having a dynamic backfield production wise, because obviously talent it is dynamic.
Well, I thought at the beginning of the season it was a lack of the ability for him to be able to distribute the touches. But looking back now, I think it's just not volume. Like there's not enough volume, because if you're running the ball consistently, everybody's going to be able to get touches in the offense. So it's not like we don't have capable backs. We've got more than capable backs. You add Taysom Hill into that mix. Obviously, you've got another dynamic ball carrier. But if you don't stay with the run game, and like you alluded to before, if you're down 2 touchdowns, it's kind of hard to justify, okay, we're going to run the ball a lot on this drive. You try to maybe get bigger chunks by throwing the football down the field. But, not sticking with the run game has definitely been something that this offense, I would imagine, would say is a shortcoming of theirs. And, that's coming from a wide receiver. Like, I love to see the ball in the air, but if you've got those guys and they're getting 6, 7, 8 yards a pop, and then there's one, for no gain or a loss, then a lot of times it feels like they move on from the run right away. Oh, we lost yards. And I guess it's situational as well. If you're in a 1st and 10 situation, you run for a loss of 2, more than likely you're going to throw the ball in the next play. So it's I don't know, man. It's hard for a play caller for sure, especially when you've got as many good offensive skill players as we have on this offense. But I think that maybe having a few too many plays in a game plan could be tough, because you're not getting really, really good at a couple of runs. But again, like, I'm not in those meetings, so I can't tell you what the game plans look like. But I do think that we've got the ability to be a really, really good rushing team, especially when you add what Taysom can do in. And I'd like to see more of that in the second half of the season, because I think being more successful on the ground will also allow us to be more successful through the air. And you'll see our offense really start to take off.
Yeah, I agree. And look, I don't think it's a coincidence the Colts game, where it was like the first one to me that the offense, they put up 38. They looked so dynamic. Taysom and Alvin were incredible in that game. I just don't, obviously for me, I don't think it's coincidence those 2 guys are producing at a high level. This offense will be humming. So, like we mentioned, 7 games left. There's still time for them, obviously, to get back on track and make us feel like, hey, it's not just about winning the division, but making some noise. Because I think, a lot of a concern for Saints fans right now is, okay, if they win the South, do they have a shot of, beating a team like Dallas, beating a team like Seattle in wild card weekend? And up to this point, I would say they haven't given fans enough to believe in yet, because when they verse teams over 500, it hasn't been ideal. But the next 2 games, you got the Falcons on the road, which will be pivotal, obviously, for this team. And then you have Detroit after in the Superdome. We're going to just focus on the Falcons game, obviously, because it's 1 week at a time. But when you look at this game, I don't want to say if the Saints lose, the season's over, because that literally and statistically would be false. But how much does a win/loss maybe change the things where, look, if they are 6-5, then you create separation with Atlanta. You feel a little bit better going into that Lions game. And on the flip side, if you don't come up on the W in that, then it's like, okay, 5-6, you're playing Detroit at home. Does this start to go on the downslope? So how much stock do you put in the importance and significance of this game in terms of the grand scheme of the NFC South and being able to win it?
A ton. I mean, you put a very good button on every single thing that I was getting ready to say, right? Like, if you're 6-5, you're feeling pretty good about yourself. You've got a Detroit team that's coming in that everybody is feeling like is going to win their division and be somebody that can contest in the NFC. This game is pivotal. And if you go to 5-6, then it feels like, oh no, like the roof is caving in on us. What's going to happen with the rest of the year? We've got Detroit coming up again. If we lose that game, we're 5-7. And then you're talking about, okay, well, we probably need to lose a few more of these games so we can get a higher draft pick. I mean, that's kind of where my head goes when you think about these next 2 games, but specifically with Atlanta, we have to win this game. I hate to call a semi-mid-season game a must-win, but this is like to right the ship, to feel good about yourself, to start the positive momentum back over after such a disappointing loss and a week off against a team that I think we're definitely better than from top to bottom. They've got a few good players over there on both sides of the ball, but I don't think anybody would look at both of these rosters and say that Atlanta's roster is built better than ours. I mean, that would just be categorically false. So we need to take care of our business. Hopefully we can heal up over this next week and a half or so. I know we're going to be still down some guys, but we still have a team that has bigger aspirations, I believe, than Atlanta this season. And we need to go over there and handle our business and show them who the better team is.
Yeah, I totally agree. Before we head out here, Lance, I'm gonna give you the last 7 games for the Saints. We're not gonna predict win-loss for each one, but I'm just curious in your mind, what do you think is a strong number for them to kind of finish through here? You got at Atlanta, at home against the Lions, Panthers, Giants. Then you finish the season at Rams, at Bucks, and then at home versus the Falcons. So in that 7-game stretch for the Saints, not a lot of great quarterbacks in that, but that hasn't been the case, for the majority of the season for them. What do you think's like an acceptable mark for them during that stretch? You think maybe it's around like that 4-3 ballpark? What do you think's kind of acceptable for them?
Well, I think 4-3 is minimum, but we can win every single one of those games. Honestly, the good Saints that we've seen a couple of times this year, it hasn't been every game, obviously, but the team that we can be can win all of those games. Now, whether we're going to go on a 7-game run, I don't know. It's hard, but it's been done before. So I think 4-3 is kind of the minimum. We need to win at least 9 games, but I to win the division, I believe. But 10 wins, I'd feel a lot better about it. But you can't win 7 or 5 until you win the first one. So I think that it's realistic that we go on a nice little run this last stretch, but we got to take care of our business. We can't expect it to just happen. We got to go take it.
Yeah, absolutely. And we'll see if that run maybe starts next Sunday in Atlanta. Saints, Falcons. Lance, thank you so much for joining the show today, man. I greatly appreciate it. We'll see what happens. And as always, guys, whether it is a win, loss, anything crazy going on with the Saints, we'll have you covered here on the Straight Up Saints podcast, the destination for the Who Dat Nation.